Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Hello and welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast. Today with myself, Ellie Arrow, coming to you from Germany, a longtime activist against sexual exploitation. And with me are...
Hi, I'm Andrea Hines. I'm an exited woman of 7 years in prostitution, and I am in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Hi, I'm Michelle Abel, and I am a survivor of familial trafficking, and I'm coming to you from Pickering, Ontario.
And today we're going to talk about the subject of language, which is really, really huge. How do we even talk about this issue? So many terms floating around, so much disagreement about what the best terms are. Everyone's got their own opinion. We'll talk about why do we use this word rather than that one. There's no perfect language, but what might be better language to discuss this very sensitive issue. And also, even words that we might not like or we use, but we have qualms with, what can the history of those terms tell us about the attitudes that, shape them and continue the usage of these terms? I'll be moderating this episode a little bit. Some of the initial terms that we'll discuss, I did a little bit of digging into the etymology. If you hear me monologuing a little bit, that's because we divided up the terms between ourselves. And later on, Andrea and Michelle will dig into some terms that, they feel strongly about. And I'll start right away with the big one that is still not out of fashion, very old term, prostitution or prostitute. Right? Where does that come from? It's an old Latin term that's been around a while, and originally it's about, people offering wares in front of a shop or in front of a house, and that morphed into exposing or offering oneself, and eventually with the clear connotation that what's for hire is sexual access to the person. It's relevant to understand that ancient Rome obviously was not an egalitarian society, especially for women. It was a slave society, and most of the women that today are sometimes labeled prostitutes would be more actually described as sexually enslaved women. But this term has really stuck around. It's still there in the media, and actually us, even though we're very critical of the sex industry, we do still use it. So there's arguments for and against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tricky one, definitely. Like prostitution, I remember whenever I first started doing advocacy, it was like the forbidden word. Nobody used that word because I think it becomes so synonymous with the labeling term of prostitute used against a woman or an exploited individual. But it's kind of tricky because I think that there is a lot of weight behind the word that really does give people that visceral reaction that we need them to have in order to understand just how harmful sexual exploitation is. So it's kind of tricky, you have issues around using it, but it really still is effective, and it's the most commonly understood term for this activity.
I completely agree. And, it's been used in such a derogatory manner at times. And so it's really important that we define what does it mean to be a prostitute and what is prostitution. And so that's not often clear in society.
Yeah, so I also use this term, but with some qualms. I don't use prostitute, but I do use prostitution to describe the system, also because it has ugly connotations. I do think the system is ugly, but when one says prostitute, like the origin of the word, it suggests there's this woman and she's just randomly offering herself up. No particular reason, that's just how it is. It doesn't highlight all the other people involved there who are really profiting sexually and financially. And so we will get later into some alternative terms, but we can make clear at this stage prostitute, so reducing someone to being in prostitution or like this, like suggesting they're just randomly offering themselves up. We Don't like to use the term, and even worse, forced prostitute, when you're talking about a traffic person, or child prostitute is very derogatory and, again, misleading and hiding the perpetrators involved in that.
Definitely. And I think, too, a big problem that I see is that a lot of governments are still using the term prostitute either in their legislative writing that is discussing their approaches to commercial sexual exploitation, or in many cases using that, again, to vilify women. So for myself personally, I was banned from America many years ago, back in 2010, whenever I was traveling with a sex buyer who was exploiting me. And I was labeled as a prostitute in the US immigration database. And that really bothered me. And, a lot of people would say to me, well, why does that bother you? Like, you are a prostitute. And there was just something about it where I never felt I jived with that term. I felt it carried a lot of stigma. I still do. And so we have to also look at how deeply embedded that term has become in policy and legislation, and how the effect that it has on those who are, being exploited.
We could talk endlessly just about this one term, but we'll move on to some more. Two that I do also find myself using, even though they're not ideal, is sex trade and sex industry. I quite like industry because then you're thinking more of, big profiteers, of which there are many, right? The pornographers and the brothel owners, usually men who really make the big bucks. I feel like that's what comes out in industry. Also, industrialized sex. It sounds, yeah, quite unappealing. It's hard to romanticize that. On the other hand, it still has sex, and I personally, I try to only use sex when it's really two people who both desire each other, which is not the basis of this industry, right? It's financial survival, or various kinds of coercion, nearly without exception, for the person in it. But yeah, some thoughts on sex trade v sex industry.
I think, for sex trade, I don't really like that term. And I prefer sex industry because it shows, well, the industry as a whole. And what does that exactly mean? So, well, I just think that the word sex trade has a negative, again, connotation to it. But if we use the word sex industry, I think that covers all aspects of what the ugliness is of this actual industry and what it entails for women minors that are trapped in it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I used to very commonly use sex trade, and now I try not to as much as possible, because I agree with what Ellie said. We have to look at this industry, this commercialization of this activity, because we're in this new era where it's not these small little micro exchanges anymore. Like, we're in big business of exploitation now. So there's a lot of people who are behind the scenes that are making a lot of money, and no one's talking about the industry as a whole. They're just always focusing on that woman, right? What is she doing? She's this, she's that. And so we need to have that zoom out approach. And I think whenever I hear the word trade, I think of an equal exchange. Like, I am trading you something for something in return. But when we look at, these systems of commercializing sex, to me, that's a taking from somebody. That's not a trade. The woman, really, all that she's giving is her soul. She's not giving anything that is in any kind of healthy capacity, or receiving anything that's in any kind of healthy capacity. And people will think that money is, but it's not, right? Like, this is a taking from somebody of their dignity, of their security, their sense of safety, so many things. So it has a loaded tone to it, definitely, with sex trade. But I have it in my book. I just released a book, and it's all throughout my book, and now I read it, and it was too late to change it. We were already so deep in publication, me and my co-author Kathy King, but I read it and I'm like, oh, cringe. I wish I could take that out now, because language does have power, for sure.
And we'll definitely link to that book in the description so people can find it. And I would just add, I know there's people who feel differently, who feel like sex trade alludes to slave trade. And I mean, we can see the legacy of the slave trade in the industry, as in who's exploited vastly disproportionately, right? Well, in North America, especially Black women and girls, Indigenous women and girls. So there's an argument for and against all of these terms. Yeah, there's no perfect language, but it's good to use things consciously, and maybe sometimes even explain, hey, the reason I use this is because the image I want in your head is not a woman in a vacuum making some choices, but a system with historic roots, deep historic roots. Historically, people do have negative associations with prostitution that are often directed at the woman, but sometimes I feel it is more complicated than that, and that shows up again in the next term that's still very common and broadly understood by people, which is brothel, right? Also called a bawdy house. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Bawdy house, or a house of ill repute. And I found the linguistic history there very interesting, because early versions of this term are a slur for somebody, meaning a vile, depraved, or worthless person, a wretch, a scoundrel, a lecher, or a harlot, but of either sex. So this could be a slur for men. I don't know if it's necessarily always like it comes from a demeaning term for women, or the system, is bad for everyone in it, because it also relates to an Old English term for deteriorate, go to ruin, or fall away, or Proto-Germanic for breaking up, falling apart, or crumbling.
I'd say those are pretty accurate descriptions for what's done to the person internally in many ways. So yeah, language has this shifting nature, this evolutionary process that it goes through. But yeah, brothel, it's not a term that we use often here in Canada. We have adopted this body rub center is really what we go off of now, which of course is synonymous with brothel, but it seems to have a lighter energy to it that makes people not feel as guilty about visiting such establishments, I think.
And I find that it's interesting that in the US, they still use brothels, the word brothel. But yeah, it's like you say, over here, the municipalities, our government, I think they find it's easier to call them, body parlors and stuff, because it gives that different connotation. Like it's easier for society to accept, which, I mean, it all equates to the same thing. It's still the commercialization of individuals. So, I whether they change the name or they don't, it's still exploitation on all levels.
I think even if we go with Body Rub Center, I would still take that over Gentleman's Club. Because really, there's never a gentleman at a gentleman's club. Let's be serious.
And we'll absolutely get into the euphemisms, because there's an endless list. But just to finish on brothel, my mental connotation is this song called House of Rising Sun. I think it's debated whether it's a gambling parlor or a brothel, but it talks about how this man goes to this dubious place and it takes his soul. He's not an authentic three-dimensional person there either, which I think is true for the John. I think the men who go to brothels lose some of their humanity there. Moving on to our next term, still very much alive and kicking, though usually shortened, pornography, right? Porn is everywhere, or how the internet today, to get around censors, likes to call it corn. Historically, it comes from Old Greek, and that is graphene or graphos, to write, and porne is actually a low class of women in prostitution versus the more higher class women known as hetera. And really, again, it's a more accurate description, like from our modern moral standpoint, is a woman who is sexually enslaved. And so pornography is, images or depictions of sexually enslaved women. And, today we mean this massive internet porn, but it's true, it's been around a while. And people debate, what is erotica, what is porn. I mean, that goes beyond our capacity in this episode today. But yeah, pretty strong language if you take the term literally.
Porn, yeah, it's a tricky word, because it's become so like accepted in culture that I don't even think that word does have a visceral reaction anymore. Like, I know some studies have looked into the usage of pornography, and in some places, I don't have numbers in front of me, but in some places it's staggering. Like over half, or sometimes 60-70% of people are self-declaring themselves as pornography consumers. So yeah, it's just, I don't know. I think if we could call it sexual abuse material, I think then, people might stop and say, do I want to view sexual abuse material? It would be much different than, do I want to view porn? Like it just has this whitewash kind of nature to it, I think, just like so many of these other terms do.
I agree. And I think when we hear our young children in school, like for me, I have young children in my family, and when they're going around using that word, oh, porn, and my friends looking at porn, imagine a child in primary school is aware of that term. And that really scares me because that's how widely used it is. And children are picking up on these terms and they know exactly what it means. They may not have viewed it, and hopefully they didn't. But the fact that they're aware of the word and it's so wildly and widely used, that creates huge concern for me in our society.
Well, and you just look at like food porn, like that's a big thing too. Like, I'm like, why do we have to do that? And we see that with so many of these terms in the industry, like Pimp My Ride, that TV show that came out, like reaching hundreds of thousands of people, at least, if not millions. And we're embedding that language in there. So all these things, we have to start looking at what we're actually trying to create as a society for how people are interpreting language.
Yeah, and the biggest aspect that we see with, these entertainers that, again, our youths are mimicking, they use this kind of language and they think that it's absolutely okay and it's cool. So we have a society that is setting up our younger generation, our children, to think that this is acceptable and this is the way that they need to be. These are some serious issues I believe that we have to look at when we're addressing changes and policies for our government to implement the proper laws to protect women and children in our countries.
I was also thinking of food porn, and I find it depressing. Porn has also almost become synonymous with like pleasure. So I like looking at food and I like looking at, I don't know, nice book covers, and suddenly that's porn. And people, if you say you're against porn, they're like, wow, are you like against sex? Are you like against masturbation? Like humanity didn't manage to, pleasure themselves and each other just fine without gonzo internet porn for our almost entire evolution, but now it's synonymous.
Well, and how much of this is honestly coming down to these big players that we were talking about who are behind the scenes that are profiting financially, doing really what is a cult tactic. Like if you look at the work of Robert Lifton, who is an American psychiatrist and author, he did a lot of in-depth work about cults. And one of the things was talking about loading the language. You can't convince people to do things unless you can get them programmed through the language. So to me, it just seems like there's this really, really strong effort that is being put forth by profiteers to really distort a lot of these things into more palatable terms. And that's another one with like sex worker. I mean, like this is a whole nother episode that we could get into, but the whole sex worker and reframing of everything into a labor analysis and looking through a labor lens has been astronomically detrimental to the work of women and feminists and allies in bringing us closer to gender equality. Oh man, my blood is boiling already just thinking about it, because this is one thing that has really bothered me, is seeing, like Ellie said earlier, people who really meet the criteria for being probably trafficking victims or, very constrained choice operating arena individuals. All of a sudden we're calling them sex workers. That's a term. It's kind of been debated about the origin of it, but it was a activist and a self-declared sex worker named Carol Lee, who in the 1970s was really attempting to unite women in prostitution and try to highlight the laborious activity that is entailed in, having sex with multiple men every day. So they didn't like the term prostitute or any of the other slurs, understandably. But I think there was this big disservice that was done in reframing all of this activity as labor in this attempt to try to give the women more respect and more social supports and things like that. It all of a sudden became this labor union focused type initiative rather than liberty and liberation of women, right? So there is some debate if it was actually even Carol Lee who coined the term. And I think Hannah Borelli on Twitter had made a tweet some time ago that I think she showed some evidence that it was actually a different woman. But either way, it's credited towards Carol Lee, who again was an activist and a member of a group in the States called Coyote, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. So again, it comes down to shaming people who are raising the alarm about this, right? Oh, your old tired ethics. Oh, it's just labor. It's completely just loading the language again, like we said, with this cult mentality.
It's again, this language does have very clear political intentions. I think the average person who uses it is just trying to be respectful, but it's a concrete political movement and claim that this is a job like any other that can be made reasonably safe simply through labor law protections. And we'll do episodes very specifically on why that doesn't pan out. But it's also then, well, then, the people making money, they're just legal profiteers. We don't have to look so closely at them, their ethics, their behavior, etc. The men who pay, oh, they're just clients. What's the big deal? And we're again back focusing on the woman. And now it's about her choice to do a job. And that's still the main debate. It's not really about anything else. So in that sense, it hasn't taken the pressure off of her. And then, for example, women who come out of the sex industry and say it was traumatizing to me, they're told you were in the wrong job, which is a horrible insult to someone who went through sexual trauma. So this language, well intentioned by some, has grown to be all over the media, right? And now it's used again. It's forced sex worker. No, that's a trafficking victim, right? Or an underage sex worker. No, that's an exploited child. They say sex worker means a consenting adult, but it's constantly used for people whose consent is clearly not there or very constrained or a literal minor. So again, this language is not helping us. It's also very vague, right? Because it's like it's a woman in prostitution, but also in porn, but also in stripping, but also in OnlyFans, right? We don't even know anymore who exactly is meant. It's very vague.
Yeah, it kind of seemed to almost have a counter effect from what their goal was, right? Because now it was, okay, recognize us as laborers, as workers, but now that has caused the public to put all the onus of any type of harm, victimization, ripple effects into community, all those negative outcomes of sexual exploitation onto the woman, right? Because it's, oh, you women are doing this job and it's negatively impacting things, and you could just choose to get another job. It just takes away all those other dynamics of poverty, of social conditioning, of third party influence, everything that really is a big part of the majority of those in the industry's lives.
And also it then launches into this whole service language, which I think is problematic, is not even the right word. I thought we want to move beyond a world where sex is a service that women do for men. Because that whole mentality, I mean, we had it for wives. The wife in a traditional marriage is supposed to deliver or owe sex to the man. I mean, I don't want this language anywhere near sex. That's not the kind of sexual culture that I want, where you can order a service from a wife or a woman in the brothel or in any other context. But yeah, this has spawned many strange adjacent euphemisms like erotic service, love service, sex service provider, or this new one because, right, I mentioned sex worker is unclear. So to say specifically woman in prostitution, now it's full service sex worker as compared to what, like half service sex worker? What is a half? What is that? Like this language is confusing everyone. It makes it harder to talk about what's really going on. And what's terms like love doing in there or erotic? Erotic could be a nice word, but this industry is trying really hard to ruin that word.
So, in my situation as a survivor, it's very hard for me to, adopt this mentality of I was an abused child. So even though I heard that, oh, well, you're a prostitute or you're acting like a prostitute or you're being sold as a prostitute, in my mind, I'm the victim. And so I think again, like it's so important here to understand the differences of when it's a child being exploited, whether they're being forced by the family because of insecurities, being financial, food, whatever, housing, all those different aspects. But it's so important for us not to call children or abused kids a sex worker. This just absolutely hurts my heart, and it makes me, outraged, because I can't believe that there are adults that support this term to address little kids.
And it's not just anyone, there's like governments and NGOs using these terms now, and I'll put some evidence in the description.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to get into that later on, but and we're going to definitely talk about that more in depth. But this is the thing, that our government is accepting this, and so is our media. And our media is actually calling minor children sex workers and child prostitutes. This is not acceptable. It's sick.
I don't know if you guys saw earlier today on Twitter, but Dr. Charlotte Proudman, who practices family law, she made a post and it was sharing an article from The Guardian saying Met officers dissuaded children from making sexual abuse claims is what a report found. And they were saying things like, a 12-year-old girl who was raped was described as, quote, sexually active with older men. Another girl who was 14 was described as, quote, seeking out sex with older men. And a girl 15 years of age was referred to as a sex worker. So it's exactly what you guys said. Like, it has become the norm language, and well intentioned initially, perhaps, it has now had this complete inversion upon itself where it's now, putting, like we said, all this onus on women and children who are victims, and now having them have to prove that they weren't exploited in this whole situation of abuse.
So we got the victim blaming aspect, but there's also active grooming through this language. And I really have to say this because I remember growing up as a teenager, sex worker was not yet that big, but there were terms that are still around and used as, advertising language sometimes for upper ends of the sex trade, like escort or courtesan, lady of the night, woman of pleasure. It presented a highly romanticized image. For me personally, because I've always been interested in East Asia, I saw the culture romanticize geisha, which actually geisha means artisan. Today, a geisha is no longer a woman in prostitution. It's someone who wears traditional clothing and performs traditional forms of art. But yeah, these used to be sexually exploited women and girls, from rural areas. Again, more akin to what we today consider trafficking. But I remember as a teenager, just these glossy images of geisha and variations of that from different cultures really leaving an impression on myself as a girl. Like, oh, I could be this sexually powerful woman.
Yeah, and even if it's not an actual labeling term, it's that connotation of submissiveness as well too. And we see that, on the opposite end of the spectrum with African women as well too, when they're saying, "Oh, they're very animalistic and very take charge and aggressive." And then when speaking of women of Asian descent, "Oh, very, soft demeanor, very agreeable." So even the language is just one part of it, but then another part too is the embedded racism that ties with these linguistic terms to give these perceptions of how that woman will behave. And then that creates that expectation by the sex buyer as to what he will be getting because he is purchasing a specific type of woman.
One other aspect to the euphemisms is, I think, the main thing that it accomplishes, aside from, protecting perpetrators of exploitation, is it makes the speaker and listener feel better, right? Prostitution is ugly. The slurs are ugly too, and we're not for the slurs, but the euphemisms, they make everything so cozy. Oh, just a worker like myself at the office. I don't need to feel bad about it or investigate it. It's all good. And this again has a long history. While I was looking into the origin of some of these terms, euphemisms, they're very, very old ones. They're back in ancient Rome. There were many, many. For example, sort of better earning women in prostitution were called meretics, which just means a woman who earns or paid woman. I mean, adults know what it means, but you could say it in front of a child or someone and they wouldn't possibly know what it means. Little less pleasant word for a woman in the street part of the industry would be scortum, which means hide or leather, or just very pleasant, again, to the listener, very pleasant and harmless, nice term, amica, which just means female friend, lady friend, my lady friend. Just my lady friend's coming over. Don't we all feel nice and cozy?
And what's interesting about this too is like you have to wonder, is this more so intended to make the exploiter feel comfortable, or is it intended to make the exploited person feel comfortable, or is it really directed towards both? So sometimes whenever I hear these terms, I think, who are they actually targeting with it? And I guess if you're part of this pro quote sex work mindset, really you want to get everyone on board. So a lot of these terms seem to be quite universal for brainwashing both the consumers and those who are caught up in the system being exploited to make it just all appear a lot better than it actually is.
And there's one more old euphemism that I want to highlight here that just won't die and is just so infuriating, and that is the term the world's oldest profession. You might have heard some feminists have turned that instead into the world's oldest oppression, and there's some merit to that. But just to say quickly where it comes from, it was coined by the author and poet, British poet Rudyard Kipling. He used it in a poem or in a short story. Well, this is a theme throughout his work. He wrote about India and the British colonial rule there. And in this particular passage where this phrase is coined and then, gets launched into unfortunate international fame, he is arguing, in India, they have this caste of women in prostitution, and that's just the way it is. Nobody debates it. Nobody wonders if that's a moral question to debate. But us British people, we are superior because we debate this. We know that empires, colonial empires, practice sexual exploitation on a mass scale, incredibly hypocritical, to try to be superior in that situation, just blatantly offensive. Why do feminists use world's oldest oppression instead? Because prostitution is most likely not the oldest profession. It arises with sedentism, agriculture, land ownership, social hierarchies, militarization, and slavery. Right? So when we go from hunter-gatherer to, farmers and then landowners and soldiers, that's when it comes about. But there are nomadic cultures that predate that, and more likely a female-specific profession from earlier times is midwife. Women bringing life into the world or helping other women bring life. I think we should try and recoin that world's oldest profession for women is midwife.
I wanted to just touch on the part before we move ahead about why pro prostitution groups want to control the terms. And I thought it was interesting that they really use this regarding commercial sexual exploitation of women and children to control language and definitions, because if you control the language, you control the message. And so they take legitimate terms and just kind of subvert the meanings of it and give this totally different connotation.
Some of these terms could have been maintained for what they were, but I think they kind of aged out in their era. And so they became less common words. And then that kind of made them, I think, a bit more ripe for the taking by people who wanted to use it, perhaps because it had some kind of power or strength inherent to it, and then just distort it for ulterior negative reasoning.
I absolutely agree, Andrea. And it's unfortunate, I look at terms like, organized crime, and I think in society, there's legitimate organized crime, by the way, that if we look at municipalities giving out these licenses for these massage parlors or rub and tugs, as they're called, or gentlemen's clubs, these kinds of things should not be happening, but they're being obtained legally. These are all avenues that allow women to be exploited, and definitely children, youths, minors. whatever term that we would like to address young people. But the point is that they're underage.
And we live in this culture that wants to call everything a pimp, but when we say through taxation of prostitution the government becomes a pimp, suddenly people are like, wow, how can you say that?
We actually had a woman here in Edmonton who tried to sue the city directly, saying, "You were my pimp. Like, you exploited me because I had to pay hundreds of dollars every single year just to have my license." And unfortunately, she was unsuccessful. But I thought that that was really powerful. And I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but, hats off to her, because we've had numerous women say that throughout the years. And I kind of can relate to that as well, that I always tell people, like, I didn't have a pimp. I had poverty as my pimp, and I also had the city of Edmonton as my pimp, because they, in 7 years of my time in licensed brothels here in the city, I paid over $10,000 just to be licensed. So when I did the math shortly after exiting, it worked out to something like 41 men that I had to have sex with to make the money to pay my city for this license, which was really a card, a piece of paper that didn't change anything for my situation. So somebody in the last few years actually called our mayor a pimp, and it did make media, which was quite shocking. But then, of course, everyone, oh, no, he's not a pimp. So, those are all kind of interesting terms too, because when we think of pimp, we think of, the guy standing across the street corner who's like watching the woman, and he's, either her so-called boyfriend, the Romeo pimp, or he's the gorilla pimp who is there to, enforce and threaten her into compliance. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of a very beautiful moment for survivors and exited women to watch the head of the system that was profiting off of our exploitation be called out for doing exactly that.
And so, yeah, what this culture is also rich in, we had the euphemisms, and then we have these horrible, horrible slurs, but only for the woman herself, only the woman in the industry. All the men orbiting around her, we don't have any. Like, one of the worst things that you can call a woman, frankly, is a whore. And many, many women who have somehow not met someone's arbitrary sexual expectations have had that slur thrown at them. And yeah, where does whore come from? Originally, it does not necessarily refer to a prostitution context. It just means a fornicator, adulterer, or adulteress. It's only like in the more modern times that it's, prostitution specific. And it's not totally clear how it comes about, but some linguists have said it intermixed over time with a Middle English homonym, meaning bodily filth, slime, moral corruption, or sin. So very heavy words. And actually, we have to thank Shakespeare that this word survived, because he used it repeatedly in his works. And then again, many translations of the Bible into English. And for the German speakers, Luther's translation of the Bible and his compatriots, they also loved using that word. Even though researchers looking back, we can't be totally sure it really means these women, were being paid for anything. It can just mean a woman who is sexually not up to the local patriarchal men's standards. And I think what this really shows us is that the fate of women is interconnected. Like, any of us could be a whore, right? And we all need to stand together against that hate. It's not like, but I'm not one, but she over there, you can call her that. That woman, that word, we just need to purge it from our language, from our vocabulary.
Oh, if I had $1 for every man who called me a whore, I would have made far more money than I ever made while I was in the sex industry. And that's even with men calling me a whore while I was in the industry. But I see that all the time on Twitter. Any survivor, exited woman speaking out is automatically a whore. Like, I could probably pull up 500 posts where I've been called that within, the 3 years that I've been on Twitter. And after a while, it kind of loses its sting, because you're like, well, it is what it is. But for a lot of women, it undoubtedly hurts, because you're trying to leave the industry and you're trying to internally shed the labels that people have put onto you. And then when people are continuing to put them onto you, when you've already undergone that inner transformation and that growth into the conventional world once again, it's very hard to really ever feel like you've truly broken free, because they always want to keep calling you that, and I often kind of laugh at it because I'm like, well, I haven't sold my body in 11 years and this man is calling me a whore. So it's this thing where this woman replied and she said, once a whore to them, always a whore. And it doesn't matter what you do, they will call you a whore. So, can we purge the word? I don't know, but we have to, as women, purge ourselves from internalizing that and giving any weight to that, because it's just like calling a woman a bitch now. It's just a new way of attacking us, really, regardless of who we are, what we've done, where we're coming from.
And you may hear this more, but somehow they use this term, oh, little whore. And it's supposed to be cute or funny or sexy. And I just don't understand that mentality at all. Like, just looking at a woman, okay, you're purchasing us. I understand that. Or we're there to service your needs. But what is this thing that some men believe that if they say that, oh, you're a little whore, or you're such a cute little whore, like that's supposed to turn a woman on somehow? I really don't understand that level of mentality, or how do they rationalize that, that it's going to change the situation or what they're doing to us in any way.
Yeah, porn has told them that we love the abuse. We love being devalued and demeaned and treated poorly. And so to them, it's almost like a nod. Like, and so much of that, like, child language is so infiltrated in there. Like, you're a good little whore. You're a good little slut. Again, had so many men say that to me. And I was like, why is little in there? Like, I don't know if it was
Exactly.
trying to make it playful or if they're just like, minor obsessed with their minds in some capacity because of, again, porn being so pedo adjacent. I don't know where it
Yes,
comes from either, but yeah, it's a common thing for sure.
it is.
And again, I've seen the German cheap papers occasionally refer to exploited minors as underage whores. Not often. I think it's slowly dying. But I also want to call out recently, I was sent a blog post by a woman called Maggie McNeil, who my understanding is she herself was in the sex trade. I don't know if she's currently, who argues the sex work is work line. And this blog post was about child sexual exploitation, and it made the case that these kids aren't necessarily that exploited. It was more nuanced than that. I can link it. People can read it themselves, make up their own minds. But what I find indefensible and immediately makes me not take someone seriously, and there is the phrasing in there, underage whores. The sentence is, recognize that 90% of underage whores sell sex to survive because laws prohibit their doing any other profitable work or applying to any standard job. Which is like, I don't know, calling for the legalization of child labor, I guess. I mean, lots to debate there, and people, again, can make up their own minds. It is indefensible to use that language for children. Why would you ever do that?
What the heck? Like, whatever happened to like your first job being at like Subway or A&W or something like that? Like, to use that, and that's always our argument, right? We're restricting the freedoms of children, and we're seeing that even in some other areas now too, when we're talking about like the gender debate too. And at what age should we permit children, if any age, to undergo medicalization and these treatments and stuff? So yeah, it's really dark. Like, I had plenty of jobs as a minor. It's not hard to get work as a minor, but of course there's labor laws that are in place to protect youth from being exploited in any conventional job, where there should be, right?
So I'm really interested in this term bottom bitch, and what exactly does that mean? Because that is just a really ugly term to refer to for a woman.
Yeah, that I want to say it's a newer term, but it's not really. It's just become more mainstream recently because of Andrew Tate using it. That's why I think it's become more popular. But bottom bitch is a term that's been around for quite some time for mostly Romeo pimps, who have kind of a stable, if you will, of women that they're exploiting. So the bottom bitch is the one who is kind of like his ride or die. She's been with him from the start. She's helped to so-called train any women who are coming into his stable, showing them the ways, ratting them out to him if they cross the line, either by like trying to keep some of the money or deceive him in some kind of way. And it's funny because like you look at the word bottom bitch, and really what it means is like she's the foundation. She's been there from the start. She's the most reliable, and everything is kind of built off of her. But really when you look at the word, it's very demeaning. Like bottom bitch, like that to me sounds like bottom feeder, like she's the lowest of the low. And so it's kind of strange. But yeah, I really blame Andrew Tate for bringing that forth, because now everybody talks about that, right? Oh, that's my bottom bitch. Even if it's not a woman in any kind of commercial sex entity, it's now becoming, again, like we're talking about this morphing of language. It's now becoming this term for what we would have called historically like your most ride or die female partner or friend to some degree. It's really a dark term. It makes my heart hurt whenever I hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you, thank you for the clarity on that, because it is hurtful. It's just, it boggles the mind just to think that, men or even other women would put a term like that for another human being. It's so hurtful.
And would wear it proudly. Like I was
Yes.
never trafficked, but if I was trafficked, I still can't see myself being proud or okay with being called a bottom bitch. Like it
Right.
just sounds so demeaning.
Absolutely.
And we are right here in the weeds with the ugly terms. I have to bring you one from Germany. That's a new word courtesy of German Johns, or men who pay for prostitution. And that is the term rip off cunt. That's a literal translation. And they use this on their online forums to refer to a woman who didn't do a good service. That's what I found interesting about forums and quite illuminating. The euphemisms do not push out the slurs. They can coexist very easily. And these men go back and forth. They call her a lady, and the next moment she's a hooker, and it's a service. But now she's a cunt for not doing the service right. Like that all goes very fluidly. And somehow it just ends back at misogyny. Well, not somehow. that's it shows how inherent it is in the system. That term is used with abandon, and they have this customer mentality. Why can't I call someone a cunt for giving me terrible service? If I got food poisoning, I'll call that, female cook a bitch or whatever. So same deal. Not that I endorse calling any woman a slur, but they feel even more enabled by the customer mentality, I strongly believe. I mean, it's true, women in service jobs experience chronic harassment, which is why it's not some kind of instant powerful liberation for women in the sex industry to now also be classed as a, service industry employee, right? So that's not getting us out of the weeds. But let's go ahead and talk about what might help us slowly get out of this swamp of horrible language. Listeners might have already noticed some of our preferences that came out in between. So I keep using a woman in prostitution or woman in porn because I don't want her to be synonymous with her situation. And I want to emphasize she is in this industry, in this situation of exploitation. And I like the term sexual exploitation to describe, a broad range of industries that commercialize sexual access to the body. There's another term that's debatable, but I find woman or person or man in prostitution the most humanizing. What kind of words do you like to use?
I agree with you. I think as much as possible, we need to try to stop using labeling terms and use action terms instead. So, yeah, a woman in prostitution, a woman being exploited. I don't personally like the term prostituted woman because I think it automatically leads to this understanding of being third party coerced or forced. So, a trafficked woman. So, like, I've had people refer to me as, oh, she was a prostituted woman. And in theory, yes, I was prostituted by my state because they issued me a license and, did all those things, but it just never really felt like the right fit. So, sex buyer is a pretty common term. And so the counter to that is sex seller. And that's the word that I probably use more than I should. Um, because it just describes what is happening like that, but it is also a labeling term, right? So in a situation where I can't say a woman in prostitution or a woman being exploited and I have to apply some type of labeled term, then I will use sex seller. because it does sound a bit more neutral, right? Like you could be selling while you are forced. You could be selling because you believe it is your choice, but it does still have that slight tinge of applying autonomy to someone who usually doesn't have it. So again, in our book, that's another word that we have throughout the whole thing, because we just couldn't keep saying women in prostitution, sexually exploited women. It had to be used a little bit more loosely, but it's not a perfect word. None of these words are, as we're discovering.
So for me, I have an issue with anyone speaking to us or talking down or using words that are dismissive and have ugly connotations to them. But one of the terms I prefer to use is exploited people or exploited women. And I find that just takes the blame and the shame of a woman or a young person, a youth. And so even in the way that I use that term, I also apply it for myself as a survivor woman and the child that survived, such ugly abuse and violence and trafficking. But I just somehow I'm able to, I don't know if the word is embrace, but I can embrace exploitation and exploited better than some of these other terms that are out there.
I think really we just need to coin a new term, because everybody else seems to have done it with all of these things. Like, why haven't abolitionists of the sex industry been able to drum up something really good? Yeah, it's tough. I haven't heard anything that is just the right fit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we should be able, if we can come up with all the other terms, I absolutely believe that as survivors and abolitionists, we can certainly come up with our own language that we find is satisfactory in referring to each other.
And so I want to make note of the term survivor, because even that sometimes people, are surprised at, what do you mean survivor? What is there to survive? You're not surviving sex. And we will go into this in this podcast many times. Just to make clear, there are a lot of near-death experiences in the sex industry, or women know someone who didn't make it out or nearly didn't make it out, be that through overt violence, usually by a pimp or a sex buyer or an abusive boyfriend, or a drug overdose, or long-term health issues caused very concretely by continuous undesired sexual contact. I'm again struggling with the language there. Sexual abuse with, many male strangers who do not care about one's well-being. That is frequently deadly. That's why survivor is a term that's, becoming more and more common.
Yeah, that's always been a term that I've struggled with myself personally. And I've really made a point to always, anytime I do writing lately or even speaking, I'll say survivors and exited women. Because, like, for myself personally, I was never, exploited as a child. I was never trafficked into commercial sex. So for me, I feel if I were to use that term survivor, even though I did, come very close to death by suicide, by strangulation, by sex buyers, all those things, I still feel like for me to use that term survivor is watering down the experience of survivors who have endured more horrific situations than I have. Like, for myself, it was more so numbness and continual dissociation. I don't feel like at any point I was, aggressively fighting for my life. Whereas I know many survivors have, ran out of trick pads and have been chased by their pimps with a knife, get back here. You didn't get the money. Like, there's been very close calls on their life. Whereas for many of us in this so-called high-end prostitution, we didn't face that extreme level of like imminent death. It was more the slow death. And so for me, I get very uncomfortable whenever people refer to me as a survivor. And sometimes I'll speak and it'll be published and it'll say survivor Andrea Hines. And I'm like, oh, and I appreciate that they're trying to honor that, because like you said, you are surviving mentally, physically, emotionally, this broad system of harm. But for me, I try every chance I can to try to encourage people to honor the women who have really, really, truly survived something so horrific. And that's why I feel most comfortable with exited woman.
I agree. It's difficult. I've questioned that term survivor, and I think that I've been referred to that so often. But like you say, I went through a really long time as an adult wondering, well, is my story even important? Because look at all these other women or other kids that suffered through worse than me or didn't make it out. And we know all these stories, and then you think, okay, well, I actually went through a period where I felt unworthy to call myself a survivor. And I know that's strange, but I've had some of these conversations with other survivors, and there are some that feel that there are people that abuse that term survivor. And then I think that there are some of us, like you say, Andrea, that we don't want to do any sort of disservice to any fellow women that may have gone through worse than us. But I've come to the understanding now that I think we really are all survivors because we've survived all the trauma and the ugliness that was inflicted upon us, or all the things that we had to go through in order to still be present in the moment.
So true. Yeah, I think some of it does stem from that self-depreciation. I'm not worthy to be considered as someone who was at danger, right? What loss would it be if I was gone, kind of thing. And
Right.
so a lot of that is deprogramming that
Yeah.
mindset, definitely. And really, the reality is at any moment in a prostitution exchange, you are vulnerable. You are at risk of death in that moment, even if the situation doesn't seem like that's the case. Like you're in this really fancy hotel, you're with a guy who you screened, so called, through ID and his employment background or whatever may be. You never know what that human dynamic can bring. And once you have that imbalance between buyer and seller based on power and money and who they're going to believe, if you take that forward, any claims of abuse, it does make it so that you are really surviving something quite dangerous, even if it wasn't necessarily that time as horrific as it has been other times with different exploiters. So, yeah, good point.
I just wanted to add, I think it's a good general policy, if possible, before referring to anyone who's come out of the industry by any term. If you can, just ask them and ask them where they're at right now, what's comfortable, because I've heard it many times. It can be really hurtful, even re-traumatizing, to constantly be called a sex worker or any other term that can feel, yeah, really victim blaming. And at the same time, I think in this activism, we need to give space for women, especially women who've lived it, but others too, to get it wrong sometimes, to still use sex work or something similar out of a habit. And we, all of our language has evolved. If we gave ourselves a super hard time for using something 5 years ago, we risk sabotaging ourselves and sabotaging others. So we need some leniency. I don't want to be dictatorial with my language. I'll be like, I'm strong in my terms. I'll help you to explain my terms, but I don't expect everyone else to talk precisely like me. That's just not realistic. So I don't want to do what a lot of the sex work side does, like, oh, you're not using exactly our language. Well, you hate women, you this, that.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think we have to be comfortable as well how we identify with people and being sensitive to what stage they're at, whether it's their healing, their trauma, whatever it is that they're working through. We have to meet people where they're at. And I know for us women, or as our group, we definitely are mindful of what language we're using and how we address each other and how we address our guests.
So, to finish this episode, we've brought some examples from media and social media on how not to talk about sexual exploitation. And I'll start with an example from the New York Post, an article from November 2023. And the headline reads, Ex sex worker recalls being forced to sleep with 20 men on her first night in a Queens brothel. The worst night of my life. Yeah, deep sigh on that one. So again, if I had to conjecture the motivation of the journalist here, it's the intention was to use dignified language. But again, people hear sex worker, they think consensual. How is that squaring with forced to sleep? And why are we so scared of words like exploited or trafficked, which is clearly going on here? And so, one way to reword this is my choice of language, would be sexual exploitation survivor recalls being forced to endure rape by 20 men on her first night in Queen's Brothel. Because actually, even forced to sleep with is too harmless to really do justice to that, level of crime and abuse here. And doesn't that completely change your mental image when you use those words instead?
Yeah, absolutely. It does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has this subconscious vibe to it. Well, and a woman I know, Kathy King, actually my co-author. I keep on talking about this book. It's like the current thing I'm doing. So sorry, everyone. She has done decades of work with media training and sensitivity because it was so common to hear child prostitute, child sex worker up until, only the last handful of years, probably. So, we have to remember that people in the media are conditioned by this language as well. And sometimes they are receptive to changing their headlines, once they know better. I personally reached out to a couple journalists and said, this person was not autonomous and how you're referring to them is incorrect. And they've actually changed it and thanked me. So, they are amenable to being educated, I think. And my example is also a news article, and it's from October 19th, 2023. It's an article in the Toronto Sun. And the headline says, San Diego overrun by scantily clad sex workers, residents and businesses say. So, right there, if you're a member of the public and you read this, that's vilifying the exploited woman. Oh, this area, our lovely community of San Diego, is now overrun by scantily clad sex workers. So they also had to describe that they're, dressed, not, I don't want to say the word appropriately because that's not the right word, but you know what I mean? They're dressed revealingly. So, why do we have to add that on to talking about who these women are as well? It's an additional layer of shaming them. So really, I think that the headline should have said, San Diego overrun by visible sexual exploitation, residents and businesses say. Because, yes, although the women are on the streets and they're the visible ones, we're also forgetting that there's Johns that are circling these neighborhoods and that they are very visible, but we're just choosing to ignore them because they're the so-called customer coming to purchase a service. Yeah, definitely always thinking, who are we pointing the attention to and what kind of tone or energy are we applying to that person in this situation?
And frankly, scantily clad is titillating language. And when we think of the images that tend to accompany these, in Germany, it's like the same four stock photos every time: legs, high heels. Sometimes, German TV and newspapers can be quite explicit in their imagery too. Partially exposed butts or breasts, it's like a porny image, but the title could still read, trafficking found in legal brothel such and such, and the image is breasts. What the hell?
Well, and exactly. And when we talk about language, we forget that there is a nonverbal way of communicating as well. So that's also a big consideration too, is like, what mental image is this making within people's minds? It might not be the words that we're using, but it is framing it a certain way, definitely.
We can also see like everyday things that we do in society, like going to cut your hair or shopping for clothes. We see everything, all the advertisements are overly sexualized. And so, it's that message that sex really sells. And so we are just seeing that, and we're absolutely bombarded with that in every aspect of normal day life.
And I just want to give a small piece of advice to journalists. I mean, this is often done to be clickbaity. If you're worried people won't click on it, at least anecdotally on my social media, I've gotten big responses when I post photos of the buyers of the Johns. There is this fantastic photo series by the German photographer Bettina Flittner, and I'll link that in the description as well, to photos of real men who go to German brothels, including some really ugly quotes from those men on why they do it. And if you put this guy there in his bathrobe or his underwear, tells a totally different story than if you're putting another so-called scantily clad woman.
Yeah, we were all scarred by that series of photos, definitely. But so appreciative to Bettina for doing that. Like, that's really shifting that mindset of who we're actually talking about, which is who we should be talking about, and that's those who are inflicting abuse.
So I came across an article from Sex Workers Alliance Ireland, and they basically say this week Centoya Brown will be released from prison after serving a 51-year sentence after she shot a client in self-defense while she was a survival child sex worker. Now, this article was from back in 2019. And here we still see, well, here's the language again, child sex worker. Why would you reference a raped or an abused child as a sex worker? How this, I believe, should be read is that, Centoya Brown will be released from prison after serving 15 years of her 51-year sentence, basically after she shot her pedophile rapist in self-defense while she was sexually exploited as a minor or as a child victim. So we see how language here again changes the image, the message that the media is trying to perpetuate.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen anyone of the so-called sex work lobby ever use the word exploitation. Like, I don't know if you guys have, and if you have, it's probably very rare, but it just seems like a word that they refuse to use. But like, how blatantly wrong is that headline? Of course we could find tons and tons, but that's probably the worst one. I remember seeing that as well, and just my jaw dropped. Like, you're going to refer to a child rape victim who was trafficked and coining her as almost like a murderer, as if as if what she did was unjust.
Yeah.
Sickening.
It is.
And I think their rationale was, well, she hasn't come out and said, I'm a rape survivor, I'm a trafficked person. She has since spoken about being exploited. I don't know her exact choice of language, but still, you cannot tell this to the public, and create this false mental image. And like, client, adult men can pay for services of children. Like, where will this get us, this language? And it's not just words. I'll also put this in the description. I have concrete examples of German NGOs who deal with exploited minors who start to use this language, and it affects how they interact. They start talking more like, this is a lifestyle choice of young people. And, it's stigmatizing to use strong language like exploited or raped. And maybe if you're the individual social worker working with the individual child or minor, and they're not ready for this, sure, don't push it on them. But when you communicate with the public, the severity of the crime is your goal. And the goal of these services always has to be to get the child out of that situation and not make her a better sex worker or something.
Exactly. It's so frustrating, but honestly, in one way, it's kind of, well, nice is not the word, but helpful, I guess would be the word, to kind of gauge where the public is on a lot of these issues based on how media is reporting about them. I mean, of course, you're still going to have these one-off journalists that, don't know what terminology is appropriate, but it really does kind of show the culture coming out of media outlets, the public's culture, right? Larger culture. So I think, when we see less of these headlines, we're going to be hopefully moving in the right direction, and that'll be the proof of it.
So this concludes our first episode on language. We want to do another one, which will follow shortly, and that's where we're going to focus on the men in the scenario, the almost exclusively men who pay for sexual exploitation, and the overwhelmingly men who really make the big money. Why we say industry, the people behind that industry that are really running things and who like to hide in the shadows and pretend they're not there. Women, they're getting assaulted and exploited by who? We don't know. We'll go over those terms, the popular ones again, the euphemisms, and then what we think is more accurate and doesn't let those men get away with what they're doing. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.